All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Well, some of you might expect, in preparing for something like this is a little bit unusual always, because there are a couple of things that are unknown. One, you never know how many people will be here, right? Or who those people will be, right? Will it be dominantly students? Will it be a mixture of students and faculty and staff? But regardless, I'm really glad you're here. Just a couple of things before we get started. First, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Garth Pauley, and I am a professor in the Department of Communication, and this is my 25th year teaching at Calvin. And I teach a class in the communication department that is called Communication Technology and Society. And so my interest in the subject matter of digital divide largely springs from that, but also from personal interest as well. So just a little bit to sort of explain who I am and why I'm talking about this. The other thing that I want to make clear from the outset is, although there's an hour and a half allocated for this, like if you're thinking, am I going to be sitting here listening to this guy talk for an hour and a half? The answer is absolutely not, okay? That, for a variety of reasons, I think that's a bad idea. So really, my goal is to keep myself to roughly 20 minutes of me talking, and then facilitate a conversation after that and answer any questions that you have. And however long that takes is how long it takes then. But I think that will be a productive use of our time. All right, so a couple of things. I'm just sort of getting oriented here in a new space as well. You look around and you realize, like, oh, there's not a clock. So, and now I've promised I'm going to try to keep it around 20 minutes. So I do have my phone. So if I'm looking down at something, I promise I'm not engaging in bad behavior and checking Facebook while trying to talk to you at the same time, but rather just trying to be mindful of the time. Okay. So first, if you don't know, I mean, and it's good, I think, for us to celebrate these kinds of things, that this marks the 22nd anniversary of Unlearn Week at Calvin, right? Which is really, it's a good thing, right? It's good. I'll say, to move quickly into my topic, the concept of a digital divide is only a little bit older than Unlearn Week. It was a term that was coined by scholars, and researchers began investigating it in 1995, right, is what most people will date it to. In its earlier versions, the term digital divide mainly referred to just a simple division between people who had access to the internet and people who didn't have access to the internet. So it's really just extremely focused on the internet and issues of access. Who has it, who doesn't? The primary divisions that scholars would look at in investigating this, perhaps are not surprising. The primary divisions, according to Access, fell, and they continue to fall along predictable demographic lines, primarily income, right? Geography, the split between urban and rural, and lastly, ethnicity. So since those early days of people investigating the digital divide, researchers have started to pay more attention to other divides that are related to other issues, some of them demographic and some of them not, namely gender, especially in the developing world. If you look at global statistics, some of them mirror what happens in the United States, and some of them are distinctive. So you'll certainly have divides according to income, geography, and ethnicity. But globally, in addition to being dominantly well-off, urban, and white, often male globally, more so than in the US. Other issues have been attended to as well, especially issues of age, and then also of disability. So the one thing I want to say is I'm not going to present statistical evidence about these divides today. One of the reasons is to do so effectively, I think, would require the use of visual aids, and I'm not I don't have a lot of trust typically, and is the technology going to cooperate in presenting things? If you've had experience doing that in classes, you know how that can go sometimes, or even as an audience member, it can be frustrating when things don't work out. The other reason that I won't present the statistical data is it's really pretty available if you have access, of course, and you do, right, by virtue of being here at Calvin. So I will say, if you're interested in statistical data about access issues, there are a couple of good places where you can find it. If you want to look for global data, you can look at an office that's a little, I think, quite lesser known of the United Nations. It's called the International Telecommunication Union, which sounds like a labor union, but it's not. It's a division of the United Nations that looks at these issues, and you can find statistics about disparities of access according to different variables. In the United States, the best place to look for it is the Pew Research Center, which also has a website, and they have projects on the internet and American life, and they look at other things as well, cell phone use. And so looking at digital inequities according to access, according to a wide variety of variables, most of them the ones that I mentioned to start. Okay, so I would invite you to take a look at those things if you would like to learn more about this topic. All right. But the main reason that I'm not going to present the statistical research is this. It tends to reduce digital divides really to disparities in technological access, and that's not the only thing that we should be paying attention to. More often, or moreover, it tends to, in its presentation of the statistical data, have a pretty narrow focus. It gives outsized attention to inequalities in employment opportunities and educational advancement that result from disparities in access.
That makes sense to everybody. I mean, there are lots of things you can pay attention to when there are inequalities in access, but lots of the statistical research, when it's presented, focuses on, because there are inequalities in access, it leads to inequalities in economics, especially employment opportunities, and then also educational advancement. The educational advancement one is not too surprising, especially because many things shifted into technological platforms during the days of the pandemic. Okay. All right. But that is a narrow way of thinking about the digital divide, I would say. No doubt these disparities are important, right? And it's important to understand them.
But for the bulk of today's presentation, I invite you to think about the nature of digital divides in a more nuanced way. And in fact, I would encourage you, instead of thinking of like a digital divide or the digital divide, to think about digital divides, plural. All right? So I would like you to think about the nature of those divides in a more nuanced way, and I invite you to think about the far-reaching consequences of how various social stratifications intersect with digital life. All right. So to begin, let me just do the first of those things and suggest a more nuanced way of thinking about the nature of digital divides. So the first category I'll use is what I'll refer to as technological means. And those are, in fact, things of access, right? I mean, it is important to pay attention to access. Does a person have a digital communication device and supporting hardware? Do they have a wired or a wireless connection? Do they have the software that's needed, for example? Are these things available to them? If so, can they afford them? Can they keep them up to date and therefore secure? But issues of access or technological means, I think, go beyond those things as well. Just for an example, an important subset of this type of divide would be an institutional one. So for example, I don't know how much you know about this, well, telecommunications laws are really complex. And so there is a structural institutional bias related to technological means in the United States. In many states, there are laws that prohibit the development of municipal broadband networks, right? So most people would say, like, if a city could develop its own broadband network, right, and have it supported by taxes and try to make access more equal in that way, that would be a good thing, right? But the law prohibits municipalities from doing that in many states. Last time I checked, it's about half of the states in the United States have laws that would prevent municipalities from developing their own broadband access and therefore making it more accessible. Moreover, in this particular, again, the institutional divide, the Byzantine system of laws that relate to American Indian reservations have made it difficult to establish internet access there, and reservations are among the most underserved communities in the United States. The worst example would be in Louisiana. 33% of tribal lands have access to broadband internet access. Right? Okay. And again, part of it seems built into laws, right? So technological means one type of digital divide. All right. Second, there are divides along lines of autonomy of use. How much control does a person have over their use of digital tools? For example, are they using a shared device in a public space, right? Which is what many marginalized groups are reduced to. I think it's okay to say it that way. Or is it a personal divide in a public space? And what are the consequences of those differences, right? For example, later on I'll talk a little bit about social capital networking, right? It's easy to build networks and sustain them if you have frequent access, right? Like if you want to maintain a robust professional network via LinkedIn, for example, easy to do if you're able to have access to things all the time. Difficult to do if you have to go to the public library and do it at the convenience of those hours and other people waiting in line behind you, all right? But there's another type of divide related to autonomy too, and it would be this. Can a person with a disability use the device on their own, or can they use it at all, right? Is an important type of what I would say still fits under autonomy of use divide. Third, there are dividing lines along the lines of digital skills and understanding. Does a person have the competency, the knowledge to use digital resources fully? Many nonprofit organizations will address this divide in particular. I know in Grand Rapids, the Hispanic Center of West Michigan, for example, offers classes to lots of people who make use of their resources, and they're very much focused in this area. I would say, and this is something that I've just learned recently, if you're wondering, like, well, where do these lack of digital skills and understanding come from, or where do these disparities happen? Well, there are lots of explanations. I think the one that I didn't appreciate fully until recently is that it often happens in our educational system. So unfortunately, our educational system, there's good reason to think, creates many of the divides in digital skills and understanding in the first place. In a book called Digital Divisions, How Schools Create Inequality in the Tech Area, the author Matt Raffalo notes that teachers in schools that serve predominantly white, affluent students, this is a quote, help translate the digital skills those students develop through their digital play into educational capital. Right? And other teachers in predominantly white and affluent students help them translate digital skills they already have or might acquire in the classroom into something that our society values. That turns out not to be the case for ethnic minority students, for example, in his study. That teachers tend to ignore and devalue the digital skills of ethnic and minority students. All right? So it contributes to divisions in skills and knowledge. Again, a third type of digital divide. Two more. Fourth, there are divides in terms of social support. To what extent can a person draw upon their networks to get help from experienced users if you don't know how to do it yourself? Not inconsequential. And last, there are divides in terms of cultural norms. How is a person's use of digital communication technology both enabled and constrained by how others and their socio-cultural context use it?
Again, something that could be easy to overlook, but something that is quite important. Okay, so we're getting at the idea here, right? There's not a single digital divide, there's not the digital divide, there are digital divides, right? I've presented 5 ways in which we can see that happen. By no means is this meant to be exhaustive. It's just to call attention to some things you will know about, fill them out in a new way, I hope, and mention some things perhaps you haven't thought about. So now I would like to turn to the far-reaching consequences of how social stratifications intersect with our digital lives. Right, which really in many ways is to say our lives, right? I mean, I'm exaggerating, but maybe only a little bit. I mean, so much of our lives are structured by digital communication technologies. I know when I teach the course for our department, like I'll put on the whiteboard, right? Just kind of like a continuum, right? From hardly structures my life at all to structures my life almost completely, right? Where would you say that you'd fall, right? And I mean, everybody ends up being on this kind of path. And it's not just true of, young college students of reasonable means, right? It's true for most of us. So much of our lives are structured by digital communication technologies. One way that I think about it is like there are 2 of the top researchers in this area recently administered surveys independently, and they found many of the same things. The surveys would ask people to complete the following prompt. Using the internet or my cell phone helped me, and then fill in the blank. And the prompt of responses was remarkable.
I think. It would be people identified job-related benefits. Indeed. They found a job opportunity that way. They got a job. They were able to improve their work. They were able to participate in a professional development opportunity. But it includes things like economic benefits. I mean, things that seem obvious to us, right? If you have the means or if you have access, saving money, purchasing goods and services online, right? Finding goods and services online that you couldn't find elsewhere. Completing financial transactions online rather than having to go to a physical bank. Selling goods and services online, right? It could be your job if you want it to be, if you have, right? If you're not kept in a diminished position by digital divides. Educational benefits, of course. Personal benefits, they talked about improving their health, finding their identity by interacting with similar others, receiving online instruction to develop or to refine a skill, right? If you don't want to go to a guitar teacher, you could take lessons online, right? For these kinds of things. It might not be as good, but it's available, right? It's available to one. There are political benefits. The respondents talked about contacting a government official or agency, receiving a government service online. It's become an increasing means for people to receive services is through digital connections. People talked about signing petitions, joining an organization, contributing to a political campaign, gaining information online that helped them make an informed vote. All right. There are cultural benefits too that the respondents mentioned. Finding entertainment that's not available offline, right? Playing certain kinds of video games, for example, right? Buying tickets for an entertainment event, creating cultural content. People mentioned, I'd be curious to play this one out, they indicated they had changed their lifestyle choices after receiving information through digital means. Right? That can mean different things to different people. Again, I'd be kind of curious to see what that meant. And lastly, social benefits, right? Finding friends, finding a date or romantic partner, having more contact with family and friends. Some people said it improved the quality of their contact. Some people said, well, maybe not, but it did increase the amount of contact. People found people who shared their interest and became members of social organizations. Okay? So these, right, I mean, you know, our lives are incredibly structured by digital communication technologies. Doesn't mean there aren't problems. Of course there are problems with how we use them. But there are a lot of benefits too. I worry sometimes when I teach the class that I downplay the positives and look at the negatives, but there are lots of positive things, right? If one has the, if you're not kept from enjoying those benefits because of digital divides, right? So if you're digitally constrained because of problems related to the things I mentioned, access, autonomy, skills, knowledge, social support, it can be difficult to fully participate in our society. I think in some ways that is difficult to appreciate if you're not in that situation. Some of those missed opportunities and inequalities keep people from flourishing and keep people down, right? They're not just matters of minor inconvenience. They're things that are significant, right? They really matter to people's lives and their sense of self and their sense of connectedness to their society. Digital divides, for example, can keep a person from having control over how and where they work, how much time they spend commuting, right? You probably can't work remotely from home if you don't have a home computer and broadband internet access, right? Having a cell phone, only a cell phone, for example, which research from the Pew Research Center shows is a lot more common among Hispanics in the United States, only having a cell phone as a network device, right? If that's the only device you have, that's probably not going to cut it if you want to work remotely, right? And so there's an avenue that is shut down. Digital divides also reinforce economic disadvantages and health disparities. Some companies, this is alarming to learn, but it's true and it's good to know. There are some companies that require their employees to use digital health trackers in order to participate in the health insurance program. Right? You don't have, ways to make that happen well, right? You'll be shut out from that and you'll look for something probably that is going to be inferior to what your employer provides. Many of you probably know, because it's on TV commercials all the time, you could get lower auto insurance rates if you use the insurance company's app, for example, right? Of course, they'll sell your data as well, but nonetheless, you could get lower insurance rates if you have it, right? If you have it, if it is available to you, if it has not been shut out for reasons I've mentioned. The ability to use or apply for government services might require a computer because some websites aren't optimized for mobile devices. This is one of those things I would say if you were interested in going to computer programming or like user experience, really pay attention to this, right? How many things are optimized for mobile use, right? Are they things that some people will be shut out from if it is not optimized for mobile use? All right. But digital divides don't just affect individual choices. For example, there's good reason to think that cultural production in the United States will continue to be shaped by commodification of our personal data, right? So cultural products, just thinking about, just for example, right? Things like television shows, movies, music, all different kinds of things referred to as cultural production, right? Lots of these things are shaped by the commodification of our personal data, right? How do we know what type of TV show do we want to produce? What can we learn about what people watch? How do we learn about what people watch? Through digital communication technologies, okay? This makes sense to everybody, right? So, so it's gathered through these devices and therefore excludes people along digital divides, right? And therefore ends up shaping the kind of cultural products that we have and what our culture looks like in many ways. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't mean to suggest that data commodification is a good thing, right? I don't mean to suggest that, whatever type of internet-connected TV you have, stealing your data and selling it to people is a good thing. It's not a good thing, but it's very difficult to find a TV that isn't using your data in that way. And so given the existence of such a system, it's good to be aware of data marginalization, right? The elimination of certain types of spaces and cultural products because they're not amenable to data commodification, and the data commodification happens along, right, the lines that we've talked about before, but especially of income and ethnicity. All right. Cultural production is shaped by digital divides in another sense too, though. So like inequalities that often manifest themselves as a lack of access, lack of autonomy, lack of skills, right, lack of support, et cetera, means that some people don't get to produce digital content and some people do, right? So for example, this study is a little bit dated. I'd be curious to see if they're going to do more updated work in this area. It's probably about 10 years old, but there's reason to think that the phenomenon is still true. So a study by the Pew Research Center found that those without broadband internet access are much more likely to read, watch, or listen to things through digital channels instead of contributing content, right? Basically, they've been cast in roles of like consumers or viewers rather than producers, which is a significant disparity, right? And there's reason to think that that's still true. Right? So digital communication technologies and networks have the potential to democratize our culture, right? It's one of the reasons that people seem so excited about them when they first came out, right? Oh, it'll expand access, it lowers some barriers, and in fact, these things are true, right? But it hasn't panned out the way that people had hoped, and I think we have to reckon with the inequalities that still exist and how they're built in and what those consequences are. So we might have, well, I'm trying to think of how to put this. Yeah, I mean, if you think about these systems, really still powerful interest, biased systems, long-standing inequalities have limited the extent to which this kind of democratization has happened. So we might have a new system of cultural production, right? And it has, I mean, made some people have access who didn't have access to it before, right? And that's a good thing. But nonetheless, it still reflects many of the biases of the previous system. And so it means that cultural knowledge is often biased as well and often limited to dominant perspectives. I think it's easy for people sometimes to focus on the exceptions. Like, I don't know if anybody's seen the TV show that is made. It's hard to imagine it in a world in which streaming didn't exist. Reservation Dogs, right? It's produced by indigenous TV makers, right? And it tells stories about indigenous people on an American Indian reservation in Oklahoma. And it's hard to imagine something like that happening in an economy that weren't based on streaming. But it's easy to, I think, for people in a culture to want to pat themselves on the back for those kinds of things rather than seeing them as rarities. All right. So Ellen Helsper's recent book, The Digital Disconnect, is instructive here, I think. She demonstrates digital inequalities in production and valuation of digital content tend to reinforce dominant cultural attitudes that some people matter and other people don't matter. Right. And here's one last way digital divides reinforce social inequalities in cultural production. Again, I don't think I really appreciated this until thinking about this project a little more. They bias the production of the technologies that create culture in the first place. Right? So in other words, I mean, a good illustration of this is a book it's called The Digital Divide, but you will forgive it, by Jan van Dijk, who notes that inequalities in innovation, who gets to create digital technologies and who doesn't get to create digital technologies, is a key component of the broader system of digital inequalities and how it contributes to culture. All right. So let me move on to talking a bit, not just about cultural production, but also social capital, which is how the talk was advertised, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that. Digital communication technologies are not universally good for social relationships, of course, and I think we all get that, but they're not all bad either. For better or worse, many of our networks and relationships are structured around technologies. So if you think, for example, how digital divides affect schools as site where social capital is built. And by social capital, I just mean norms and networks that help maintain and build a civil society, right? So if you think about schools as a site for that, right? As a parent, to what extent would your involvement in your children's school be limited by the divides I've mentioned, right? What if you didn't know how to use the platforms that the school used to communicate with parents or help you keep up to date on how students are doing or what's going on in the community, right? What if you didn't have access to it? What if you couldn't communicate with other parents? How would it limit your involvement in the community? How would it really, in some sense, limit your standing in that community as well? Right? If you're a student, to what extent would your ability to make friends be limited by the divides we've been discussing? Right? I don't think this is a stereotype, I just think it's a reality. What if you're an adolescent boy, for example, who doesn't have broadband internet access, needed to play certain types of video games online with one's classmates, right? It's a significant way in which capital among boys is created, right, and sustained, and by which one establishes networks and becomes part of a community, right? Digital divides affect that significantly. There are loads of other examples I can think of, but again, I want to be mindful of time. I think about just like my own experience coaching youth sports, which is often unfriendly to ethnic minorities in lots of ways, and digital divides in that context, I think, limit social capital as well. But let me mention one last site where cultural capital can be built, and in this way, I think really can be put to good use via digital communication technologies, and that is social movements. So social media platforms, for example, can be useful tools for organizing resistance to oppression and gathering like-minded people and people who share similar, I don't quite get it right, but certainly, I mean, cultural disadvantages, right? I mean, it becomes a way to build capital and also to fight against the things that bound people together in the first place, right? So it can be useful for raising awareness among broader audiences as well, mobilizing people to act, right? One thinks of things like Black Lives Matter, for example, being facilitated in many ways by digital communication technologies. But digital activism and resistance still requires access, right? It still requires autonomy. Good luck running a productive social campaign if your only access is on the old computer in the public library, right? So skill, right? Support, and also normative practices, right? Is this seen as something somebody in your sociocultural group does, right? Is it seen as an appropriate type of thing? So the activism is limited by those things. And I should say, even when digital activism works, it's often limited by other forms of cultural bias. So for example, many of you probably know this, beginning in 2016, members of the Standing Rock Sioux and their American Indian allies used social media strategies as part of their opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? It got a lot of attention. It seems good, and in many ways it is good. But on the other hand, right, I think because of some of the digital inequalities I've mentioned, non-Indigenous allies seem to pretty quickly take over the online activism, okay? And because they took over the online activism, traditional media coverage, right, traditional news media coverage of the protests was soon dominated by non-native perspectives, right? And it's not accidental that that happened. Okay. All right. So in closing, let me just say these things. I hope that you will take a couple of things away from our time together today and my talk and discussion that happens afterwards. So first, as I mentioned before, I hope that you'll think about digital inequalities as digital divides, plural, rather than a or the digital divide. Second, I hope you'll understand that digital inequalities result from a variety of factors, not just limited access. And again, the list I provided of 5 things, not meant to be exhaustive, but hopefully expand things a bit. Third, I hope you'll think about the far-reaching consequences of digital divides, including those related to cultural production and social capital. And finally, I hope that you'll be motivated to learn more above all, that you'll get excited about this and you'll want to look into it more and think, and what do you have to contribute to people's understanding of digital divides? And above all, that you'll be able to use that to connect with others in order to break down the digital divides that reinforce and create new inequalities in our society. So thanks for your attention. So as I mentioned, I mean, first of all, I'm glad to answer any questions, whether, hey, you used a term and, cultural production is a fancy, new term maybe to me, Professor Pauley, right? Could you explain that? I'd be glad to do that, right? Provide an example of something. I'm glad to do those things. Does anyone have those kind of questions? Yeah.
Could you repeat the 5 divides?
Sure, absolutely. So first would be technological means, right? Again, largely the access issues, but also structural things that contribute to those access issues. So second would be autonomy of use, right? Where are you able to use it? How independent can you be? Third, digital skills and understanding. Right? Fourth would be social support, right? If you don't know how to do it, is there somebody else that you could talk to that's available to you to learn? The last one is cultural norms, right? Are there people within your in-group, so to speak, right? What seems normative and is using digital technologies or using them in a certain way, normative or non-normative? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you, first of all. It's a really important justice issue. In the last session that I was at, somebody talked about failing all their classes during the pandemic because they were trying to do their class with their iPad from China and did not have good internet. And so then that sets you back money-wise and other things, or GPA, let's say. I'm wondering, for that first divide that you talked about, has there been data yet about the pandemic and how that either broadened the divide, especially when thinking about virtual schooling for children in the last two and a half years?
Right. Not surprisingly, scholarship on these kind of areas develops a bit slowly, right? There was always a lag. And of course, it's not all behind us either. The things that I've looked at, well, just thinking more broadly. So, I mean, over time and in the past 10 years, the disparity between people having the haves and the have-nots in broadband internet access has narrowed for many ethnic groups. But at the same time, it's always reported as well, it's getting better. But a 10% disparity is still a 10% disparity, and it's not inconsequential if you're in that percentage, right? But so there is kind of shrinking of that, which suggests, this is a crude way of putting it, maybe it's better that the pandemic hit when it did rather than earlier, because it would have been worse yet. And it's still plenty bad now. If you look at it in a simple sense, the coming together of access to cell phones has been even more so that there's hardly any, the divide is quite a lot smaller according to cell phone. But as I mentioned, then if you start to look at, well, how many people have a cell phone and also broadband internet access, then you see pretty significant things. And of course, trying to do, maybe some of you can, right? I mean, can you imagine trying to access content on Moodle for a class, right? Right. That was lots of students' experience. Or like you said, I think professors at Calvin had a number of these. I had a student who was taking oral rhetoric class from me when the lockdown happened and would have to, and then the libraries are locked down as well, and it's sort of like sitting in the parking lot at the public library trying to log on and being able to use Moodle for stuff. So at college, of course, but at the lower down level, even more so, right? Yeah. And I think sometimes people, part of it is it was hard to know what to do, right? But the other is I just think lots of people are blind to whom it's affecting and who it's not, right? Or a kind of resignation to, oh, yeah, this isn't good, but what else are we going to do? Yeah. Yeah. Adrian?
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions.
You can do whatever you want, man.
So I felt like a lot of the divides you talked about were either access to technology or access to education in order to use that technology, and it's probably pretty intertwined. But do you see it as access to technology becomes more ubiquitous, like phones get cheaper, computers get cheaper, there's more internet? Do you see that gap closing, or does the research show that the education piece will still be cutting people off? And that gap will continue to grow or stay the same?
Right. It's difficult to know, right? And I will say in some of those areas certainly is outside of my expertise. Right? For me, at least, it's a little bit difficult to imagine that the way that the educational differences sort of kind of get inscribed, so to speak, as researchers sometimes talk about, in the educational system. It's hard to imagine that won't continue, right? The book about that just kind of makes pretty clear these pretty strong biases, right? So, just for example, along ethnic lines, the researcher found that teachers would tend to treat and the research itself acknowledges the kind of ugliness and problems of these terms, but like, Asian students, right, as almost as like potential like hackers or something, like what they're getting up to can't be good somehow, right? And then one of the other schools was largely blacks and would be, again, almost kind of like dismissive of skills that the students brought in, a kind of, like how could these students possibly have much or anything that would be good, right? So lowering the threshold for availability isn't going to deal with those things.
And so then even as the gap is closed, there's still perceived, I guess, biases that inform how seriously people take those skills or...
Right.
Yeah.
And then also, and learning them too then, right? I mean, being able to have the educational system that, enables the skill set and interest you have rather than suppressing them to some extent. And I think that's especially true. And, I mean, like how, it can be reductionist when something like Black History Month does this, I think. But when looking at look at all the inventions that are important that were created by African Americans, right? But at the same time, it's really important to pay attention to those things, I think, right? And you just think about if you have certain segments of the population not involved in technological innovation for reasons that don't relate to how available those things are, but sort of opportunities to be innovative in those ways, right? I mean, those problems are going to persist, right? Other questions? Yeah.
The other thing I'm thinking about is the technology itself and whether there's biases in it, like algorithmically, in terms of there's content creators that use their content to like prosper, like businesses and things like that. And sometimes I hear complaints. TikTok has been a big one, Instagram, about the algorithm elevating and censoring certain accounts and not others.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, certainly in terms of cultural production, right? And then even, and besides, right, I mean, because machine learning is built into so many digital devices anywhere, right? So any biases that are apparent in the algorithms will, affect how people use them and how they're produced. But I think too, I was talking with students about this recently with, so like a little bit of forecasting, and there's reason to think that this will happen. Lots of companies, let me just take Google for example, would really like to move web searches away from you typing in your web search and that you're interacting with a voice device, and that becomes the way that you search the web, right? That's its own thing, and you should not want this to happen, by the way, okay? But in thinking about that and talking about with the students, we also had a conversation about how it is that the voice devices themselves, mainly in terms of natural language processing systems in them, are culturally biased, right? So I mean, they expect certain grammatical structures, right? They expect certain vocabularies. They expect certain cadence of speeches that are, right, ugly word, normalized, right? But normalized for whom? So again, there's a built-in bias of the device and how it functions. Yeah.
Kind of a comment there as well. The technological divide is shifting in a lot of ways. So older technologies are no longer compatible with software, and health tracking also is requiring of a watch and things like that. So even though Chromebooks are the cheapest on the market, you can't download Excel onto that. Which is like a huge amount of work is done there, especially professionally. So
yeah,
we're shifting.
No, it's a good point. So I haven't talked with them a ton, but I had talked before the semester began with folks at the, I mentioned the Hispanic Center of West Michigan, right? Some of you probably know where it's at. If you go on Hall Street, right, like all the way just past 131 on the other side is where they're headquartered. And so they were able to get grant money for some of their programs, and as I mentioned, lots of them will be helping people with certain skills, right? And they have a variety of people that they serve. They said some of it maybe are things you would expect. It's like older people in the community that they serve, and there are some things like, they'd like to be able to learn how to like FaceTime with their grandkids who live somewhere else, and they have no idea how to do FaceTime, right? But in terms of getting devices for them, they also got a grant. I think it was maybe 200 or 300 laptops that they were able to distribute. But they have the problems that you mentioned, right? I mean, the things that seem like they'll serve the most people serve them in a limited way, right? And if that's the means by which one gets one, then yeah, they're limited in exactly the ways you said. Yeah.
So, our boys' school, I had each kid had an iPad. Another local affluent school, each child gets a laptop. Is that commonplace for schools where there is more range of socioeconomic means?
Sure. Again, that would be pushing the margins of my expertise for sure. And I think it would be difficult for anybody to get a super comprehensive sense of that, would be my guess, but maybe I'm wrong. I must admit that I don't know. But if you think about the means by which it happens, it's hard to imagine that it would be super widespread or that it wouldn't have problems. I mean, just like Chromebook is affordable, but has its limitations. Is everybody aware of what those limitations are and what the consequences of those limitations would be? I would certainly think that would be part of it. The other thing, right? I mean, this fits under what I refer to as the technological means problem, right? That type of divide. I'm trying to think of how to explain this. It's really weird. Is that trying to get grants for these things for the populations that are underserved? It's like, well, how do you find out about those grants? Sadly ironic, how does one apply for those grants? Also, sadly ironic, okay? So for example, I had talked recently with a person who's in charge of IT for the Huron band of Potawatomi Indians in our area. So they have an office in Grand Rapids, and the tribal headquarters is near Battle Creek, right? So they were able to get a grant from a program that was administered by the federal government that was called the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, okay? And so lots of money was distributed that way. But and it's not, I mean, I don't think, it's not for me to say that it was bad, but he had said, like, we already have a pretty good system of broadband internet access for people who live on the tribal lands. Whereas in some places, people are using like old copper wires and trying to make it work somehow, right? And I just kind of wonder, and I don't know at this point, how much is it that the sort of better off tribes got the grants, right, versus some of the people, as he acknowledged, who didn't get it, and how much of that is due to not even knowing about it because how the information is disseminated. But also, if anybody's tried to use the federal grant system, I mean, it's all online, and even if you've done that kind of work before, it's not easy, right? I mean, there's definitely difficulties related to understanding. And so, again, American Indians are severely underserved by these things, and there's still barriers, even when there's money and grant programs available, do they not serve them well? Yeah, and I would think maybe the same things for schools, right? It wouldn't be difficult to imagine that a wealthy school might have a grant officer, right? Which then sets you up well. Your school doesn't have that, well, sort of keeping you where you are a bit.
Based on what you know, are there countries that model technological equality better than the U.S.? And if so, what can we learn from them?
Sure. I'm glad you asked, and I'll admit my own ignorance about some of these things. I mean, I will say just, here and there, I mean, as you would expect, there are places that are worse and there are places that are better, right? The places that you can kind of expect it to be better, at least in terms of access, again, which is what lots of the research will focus on for better or worse, will be places that see it as a public good rather than than something to be made money off of by private interests, right? So like the place that doesn't have laws that keep municipalities from developing it as a public good, at least with regard to access, are going to be better. And I mean, you can think of countries like that, although even in some of those countries, those things are starting to break down, right? I mean, lots of people are concerned about what that's going to mean, like in Scandinavian countries, for example.
Relatedly to that early good question, I was going to ask if there were pivots or pivot points that we might look for to heal digital divides. Do you have some favorites, or you're like, here's something we should be doing?
Sure. This sounds good. I mean, I feel like this sounds lame, but for me, I mean, I think it's true. It's not just like the more you can learn about these types of divides, right? Although that's important, right? But I think the more that people can really try to appreciate the significance of it, right? It's so difficult in any sense to appreciate other people's experience, admittedly, right? But it's also easy to just, yeah, there are disparities. I understand the categories, right? I understand the categories of how it affects people. But yeah, you don't really understand the depth of consequence it has on people's lives, right? I would always think that's a pretty good starting point, right? Part of the difficult, I mean, you can read things, and I mean, there's lots of good stuff available, some of it in public, I mean, like, you know, places like The Atlantic and tech magazines like Wired will talk about these things and help people gain a greater understanding of it. The best way to understand it often is by, you know, interacting with people face to face in those circumstances. And unfortunately, because of, well, the social stratifications that lead to the things I'm talking about often lead to lack of significant interaction among people, but that would be good. I think especially for students, volunteering at places that serve in this way is a really good way to learn and appreciate, right? That then it just, I have found in my class, sometimes students will tend to stereotype a bit about digital divides. And I always think if you went and volunteered somewhere, then it would be easy to move beyond that. For me, I think that's one of them. But I think also in administration of things like grants of just, I mean, the grants can make a huge difference, right? If the information about how to get them and how they're available and providing help for people. And you know, it's something that people who have that kind of experience can do. It's another way to volunteer for sure. Other questions or comments or things that people wanted to share? I mean, like, you know, if anybody here is an expert in, you know, telecommunication laws, it rates to like tribal governments or municipalities, by all means chime in. Trying to make sense of that stuff is not easy.
I just wanted to know, have you heard or possibly read anything about the increasing infrastructure that should be happening by 2030 across the country? What I'm actually asking about is I've read something in the Washington Post that by 2030, literally it's supposed to be like every 1 in 3 people are supposed to have digital broadband accessible to them. So that means, you know, towers everywhere down south, rural counties, things of that nature. But have you heard any talk about, is that timetable true or coming to fruition?
Sure. Again, I will say, just because of my expertise, right, I mean, one can't know everything, and this is one of those things I must admit, it would be difficult for me to say absolutely, like with any specificity. On the other hand, I will say I'm a bit of a natural skeptic about these things, and it's not uninformed skepticism. So just for example, one could imagine, am I saying this is absolutely the case for this? No, but one could imagine that it would be the case. People will often get excited about ways to break down barriers in access, right? And people will come up with ideas, right? But then when you look at, do they actually make sense or translate into practice, right? It often doesn't. And again, it often is done by, you know, I mean, I'll put it bluntly, although I think I fall into this category, but it's often privileged white men who come up with the ideas about these things, right? So you take someone like Elon Musk, who says, I'm going to establish a satellite internet project, right? And we're going to do that, and that's going to be the way to bridge the urban-rural divide, right? So that it doesn't have to be wired, right? And you'll be able to get it, but it hasn't turned out to be any less expensive or any more reliable. For example, I've had students in my argumentation class write papers about this. So if we're banking on things like that to make it happen, I would say there's good reason to be skeptical. Yeah, that's about all I could say.
I want to just say I appreciate you naming multiple divides, because I think I've been thinking in a couple of divides, but not as many other divides. And so a couple of other things come to mind in thinking about the multiple divides. But the knowledge, like who can show you how to do something, where is that? I'm seeing that more and more in some of the communities that I've been involved in, and really personally have an older aunt who thinks I am a technology genius. Right? It's good to go and be affirmed to go over.
I was going to say, take it. You could. Everybody could use that kind of affirmation.
I am a technology genius. But I find just in even understanding, right? And I think of my mother-in-law who didn't want anything to do with Facebook or anything else like that because she didn't want everybody knowing her business. Like, well, if you don't put it on there, it's not going to be on there, right? So just even having someone who has a little bit more knowledge than you, and to know who that person is, to be able to help them understand what it is they can do. But even with that, when I think of who are the people that I know that have a lot more knowledge and know the shortcuts and have access than I do, if I didn't work at this university, I don't know that I would have that kind of access. So working at this university has given me a lot of access to knowledge and even technology. But if I needed to, I could go get a loaner laptop or whatever, right? But not being at this university, and if I was just in my community, which is what, 75% African American, generally lower socioeconomic status, I don't know where that knowledge would be. And so hearing you talk about the multiple divides has just been really helpful in thinking about all those domino effects that happened with that. And then the other thing I would comment, even if, as my sister said, oh, is it true you're going to add all these things? I said, you're going to add all that one, but if people don't know what to do with it, or if there is fear associated with it, or if it doesn't look like that's really going to do me any good, why would I bother? That's difficult.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And having people you can turn to for support, I mean, how do you even get started if you don't have certain degrees of knowledge, right? Even if you're excited about it and think it could bring benefits to you, and suddenly broadband internet access becomes available in your area, right? And maybe somehow, right, either your own means or, again, like a grant program like I mentioned, you're able to have access to a device. There's still other barriers. Some of them, again, can be economic and physical things, but knowledge ones, right? Like if you don't know the difference between a modem and a router, for example, right? And lots of people don't, right? And you don't have anybody you could talk to that could explain that to you, right? Without saying, well, just go online and look. Oh, no, right? Okay, right.
Yeah. Or even know that there is stuff like that, right?
Right, yeah. Oh, if it's plugged into my house and I have the thing, we're going to be all good to go, right?
Yeah.
I think it's easy for people to think like, surely nobody could, but surely indeed. Right? Yeah.
So have you come across any examples of like organizations where they're taking like college students and can like teach people in that community, or have you seen like any examples of that kind of connecting work?
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, this is, sometimes it comes in unexpected places. Kathy and I are married. I think she's helping me, but with this, or maybe not. But if you're not,
Fast already past it.
well, I know. So she grew up in Iowa and was part of 4-H. So 4-H is actually one of the organizations that is doing this, right? I mean, people tend to associate it just with agricultural types of things, I think, but yeah, I mean, like, I remember when I first learned about it, it was a picture of this black girl, probably 12 years old, serving her community because she understood these things, right, for a variety of reasons, right, and wanted to, make that knowledge available to people in her community across ethnic lines, but in particular, for people from her ethnic group, culture. Yeah.
And it's had to be either early in the pandemic or just before the pandemic. I don't know if it was locally, but it was a story that a car dealership was hiring younger kids to teach their older clients how to operate their cars because of all the technology that is in a car.
Sure.
And so it wouldn't have to be the sales associate, wouldn't have to spend a lot of time saying, okay, this is what this button does, this is how you program, this is how you get the clock to work, this is how you get the radio station to work. And so even something like that is an example where they can bring, kids who didn't know how to drive, but they knew how to operate all the technology that was inside the car.
Yeah.
That was helpful for the most part, older people who were getting in the car but not understanding all the technology.
Sure. And I would say the 4-H thing, as a response to your question, Craig, right? If people want to do something about it, and especially in terms of the area of knowledge and skill, the 4-H has a lot of money for it. It turns out. I mean, they really, and it's more direct and more local, right? It's like there's less layers of bureaucracy to make it happen, and more than that, it's people from within the community rather than out the community, which I think is more ideal, right? It's not nice to have people from the outside talking to you, and the tendency that can come from talking down to you. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
So something I realized a lot growing up, and it's not just relating to this topic, but other topics too. I grew up in Naperville, outside Chicago. It's a very privileged area, and so in that sense, we wouldn't really encounter a problem like this very often because I would say probably 98% of people in Naperville have perfectly good access to Wi-Fi. And so something, like I said, relating to other topics, but also this one is people can look at numbers on the Pew Research or they can hear stories, but for them, until they encounter it themselves, it's not as real. So how would you recommend reaching people like that who have trouble recognizing that these are real problems without actually seeing it face to face? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. I mean, it's hard to make it happen, right? I mean, you can suggest, as I mentioned before, volunteerism as a way to do it. There are some churches that will do it, right? That will try to get the young people at the church, others as well, but oftentimes young people to think about it and to provide opportunities for them to learn about it and help in that. So that certainly can be a way. I would like to be optimistic and think that it could happen at schools at a variety of levels, but then, please don't, I hope no one will take offense, right? But you can imagine that's the sort of thing, but hey, you're talking about structural biases in technology, that's critical race theory, my friend. We're not teaching that sort of thing here, right? So school could be a good place for it, but it's hard to be optimistic about school actually being a place for it.
So the one example in our department of a good thing was, one of our master's students did his master's project for a food co-op on division. And so the primary group of people they were trying to get were kind of people below the poverty line. Well, they didn't have access to the usual means that we usually think about for advertising in the communication department. So he had to think of, well, if these people are kind of suffering from that digital divide, how does he reach them? So he does the food co-op. So because he had to have this project where he was trying to advertise the services of the food co-op to a population that did not have access to these things, it really helped him realize kind of the differences.
Yeah, the disparity in skills goes both ways, right? It's just that one is more privileged than the other, of course. But yeah, I mean, people with privileged backgrounds, you don't have to learn for advertising. How do you make an ad for a Spanish language radio station, right? But if you learn how to do it, right, then it does help you appreciate, oh, yeah, this community's experience of communication is very different than mine, right? And in this case, non-digital. But, yeah. Any remaining questions or comments, or again, things you want to share with other people here? We don't need to be playing tennis with me, always one hitting the ball back, right? Well, thanks so much for coming and sharing the afternoon with me and with each other, and it's been a pleasure to see you all. I'll stick around in case there's things people wanted to talk about or questions you had that you didn't want to mention in front of others, but once again, thanks for coming.